So, imagine you've just been handed a sealed metal container full of food. You're hungry. You have no idea how to get inside it. The label says nothing useful. There's no lid, no pull tab, no obvious seam you can work with. The only instruction anyone ever gave soldiers and explorers handed these things was, essentially, figure it out. Use a rock. Use a bayonet. Use whatever you have. Just don't cut yourself too badly. That was the reality of the tin can for roughly 50 years after it was invented. The can came first. The opener came decades later. And that gap, that strange, almost absurd gap, tells you something important about how invention actually works. It doesn't follow a logical sequence. It follows urgency. And the urgency that created the tin can had nothing to do with convenience. It had everything to do with armies starving in the field. By the late 18th century, feeding soldiers on campaign was one of the most persistent and deadly problems in military logistics. Food spoiled. Supply lines broke down. Armies that could win battles were being hollowed out by scurvy, dysentery, and simple hunger. The French government, under Napoleon's expanding military ambitions, offered a prize to anyone who could solve the preservation problem at scale. A Parisian confectioner named Nicolas Appert spent years experimenting. His answer, developed around the turn of the 19th century, was to seal food inside glass jars and heat them. It worked. He didn't fully understand why. The science of bacteria and sterilization wouldn't be articulated for decades, but the results were undeniable. Food sealed this way lasted. He collected the prize. Glass, though, breaks. It's heavy. It's dangerous on a ship or in a pack. A British merchant named Peter Durand took Appert's core insight and filed a patent in 1810 for preserving food in vessels made of tin-coated iron. The tin can, as a concept, was now real. Within a few years, commercial production had begun in England, supplying the Royal Navy and polar expeditions with preserved meat, vegetables, and soup. Here is where the story turns strange. These early cans were not the thin, lightweight cylinders we know today. They were heavy. The iron was thick. The seams were hand-soldered. A single can might weigh more than the food inside it. And opening one required a hammer and chisel, or a knife strong enough to punch and saw through the metal. The instructions on some early cans reportedly told users to cut around the top with a chisel and mallet. Nobody designing these cans was thinking about the person who would eventually need to open one in a kitchen or a camp. The design problem being solved was preservation and transport, not access. The can was a vault. Getting into the vault was the user's problem. For decades, this remained the situation. Canned food spread. It fed expeditions to the Arctic. It supplied armies in the American Civil War. It began appearing in civilian pantries as production costs dropped and the canning industry grew. And throughout all of this, the method of opening a can remained essentially improvised violence. The can opener as a dedicated tool didn't appear until around 1858, when Ezra Warner of Connecticut received a U.S. patent for a device designed specifically for the purpose. It was a sharp, curved blade attached to a guard. You'd puncture the lid and work the blade around the rim. It was an improvement over a bayonet, but it was still aggressive and required some skill. The U.S. Army used versions of this type during the Civil War, with soldiers sometimes sharing a single opener among a group. The more familiar rotating wheel cutter, the kind that grips the rim and rolls around the edge, came later still, with William Lyman patenting a version in 1870. Even then, refinements continued for years. The smooth, safe, easy-to-use can opener that became a standard kitchen tool was the product of incremental improvement across the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th. Think about what that timeline means. The can was invented in 1810. A practical, purpose-built opener didn't exist until 1858. That's nearly 50 years during which millions of cans were produced and consumed, and every single one of them was opened by brute force or improvisation. The system was incomplete by design, or rather, by the absence of design thinking about the full experience. The reason for this gap isn't negligence. It reflects something true about how new technologies get adopted. The people who invented and manufactured cans were solving a specific, urgent problem: keeping food edible over long distances and long periods of time. That problem was so significant, so valuable to solve, that the secondary problem, how do you actually get the food out, was treated as someone else's concern, or simply assumed away. There's also a material explanation. Early cans were thick enough that the idea of a small handheld tool opening them cleanly would have seemed implausible. As manufacturing improved and can walls became thinner and more uniform, the mechanical problem of opening them became tractable. The opener became possible partly because the can itself evolved. The consequences of this gap were real. There are documented accounts of soldiers and explorers resorting to gunshots, rocks, and improvised blades to open cans in the field. The food inside was preserved perfectly. Getting to it was the obstacle. In at least one famous case, the ill-fated Franklin expedition to the Arctic in the 1840s, the cans themselves became part of a larger disaster, though the causes there were multiple, and the full story remains a subject of historical investigation. What's less dramatic but more consequential is what happened after the opener arrived and improved. Canned food moved from military and expedition supply into the everyday household. By the late 19th century, canning had become an industrial operation. Factories were producing canned tomatoes, canned fish, canned fruit, canned milk. The opener became a standard kitchen implement, and the presence of shelf-stable food in the home quietly restructured how people thought about cooking, shopping, and storing food. You no longer had to buy vegetables the day you planned to eat them. You could stock a pantry. You could eat foods out of season. You could feed a family through a hard winter without relying entirely on root cellars and salted meat. The can, once it became genuinely accessible, changed the rhythm of domestic life in ways that were gradual and largely invisible. Not a single dramatic moment, but a slow shift in what was possible and expected. There's a counterpoint worth acknowledging. The spread of canned food also brought concerns that took time to surface. Early soldering used lead, and there is evidence that lead contamination was a real problem in some early canned goods. The industry moved away from lead solder over time, but the transition was not immediate, and the health implications of early canning practices are part of the historical record. Convenience and safety didn't arrive together. There's also the question of what was lost. Preserved food is not fresh food. Canning changes texture, sometimes flavor, sometimes nutritional content. The trade-off between preservation and quality is real, and it shaped which foods became canned staples and which didn't. The system optimized for shelf life and transport, and consumers adapted their expectations accordingly. Today, the can opener is so ordinary that it barely registers as a tool. It sits in a drawer. It's used without thought. Some cans now open without one, with pull tabs and easy peel lids that have made the opener optional for many products. The problem that took 50 years to solve has been solved so thoroughly that the solution itself is disappearing. But the underlying lesson of the tin can and its opener is still worth sitting with. A technology can be genuinely transformative, and genuinely incomplete at the same time. The can preserved food across distances and seasons that would have been impossible before. It also left users stranded in front of a sealed container with no good way in. The invention that changed everything came with a gap built into it. A gap that took half a century and a separate invention to close. That gap wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of scope. The people who built the can were thinking about preservation. They weren't thinking about the kitchen. And that distinction between solving the problem you set out to solve and solving the full problem the user actually faces is one that shows up again and again in the history of technology. The can got into your pantry. The opener got you into the can. Neither one was sufficient alone. And the 50 years between them were filled with people making do, improvising, and occasionally injuring themselves. Until someone finally asked the question that should have been asked at the beginning. Once you've preserved the food, how does anyone actually eat it? Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.